and the Fed. But my first passion was actually medicine. In fact, I've been a medical doctor for nearly 60 years. So I view the coronavirus pandemic through a different lens than most politicians, and certainly different than the experts you see on TV right now, which is why I'm reaching out to you today through this video. There's an important message I worry is lost on those who are listening to the media's hysterics. What I'm about to share might sound controversial, but I'm not trying to scare anyone. I've always tried to be a voice of sanity and reason, even in turbulent times. But my beliefs often run counter to the mainstream narrative. I simply want to let you know what's really happening and show you something you and your family can do today to protect yourselves from what's really lurking around the corner. Because no matter how you look at it, the government is going to use this crisis to gain even more power and control of our lives. See, right now, we're hearing it all. Everything from, the coronavirus is just like the flu, to an estimate that more than 100 million Americans will be infected. At this point, it's unclear just how the coronavirus will ultimately shake out. Either way, one thing is certain, this pandemic is being used by those who want to profit politically from the panic. I realize this might seem shocking given everything we've been told in recent weeks, but just look at the facts. Since September, the common flu has infected 36 million Americans and killed an estimated 22,000. But nobody ever suggested a fall or winter quarantine. Same with tuberculosis, a disease few of us worry about. More than 10 million people worldwide fell ill with tuberculosis in 2018, and it killed 1.5 million. Or consider the fact that 38,000 Americans die every year in car accidents. Nobody has ever used that as a reason why Americans should stay off the streets. The coronavirus is a drop in the bucket compared to the worst pandemics in history. The Spanish flu, for example, left 50 million dead. The Black Plague killed as much as 60% of Europe. Why is there so much fear and panic then? Well, I think it has something to do with this. The media has created a terrifying narrative, having mentioned this virus 2.1 billion times just by the end of March, scaring anyone who watches the news that this is the apocalypse. But even the academic research is reaching the conclusion that this crisis is blown out of proportion. It was barely reported anywhere in the news, but Nobel laureate and Stanford biophysicist Michael Levitt says there's no statistical support for the government's prediction that millions of Americans will die. His conclusion, we're going to be fine. And the epidemiologist who created the main coronavirus model that's been cited in the New York Times and used by government health organizations worldwide, drastically downgraded his previous projections based on new data. He says he's reasonably confident that the medical system will be able to keep up with the virus. But none of these facts matter to the elected officials who overreact with easy money handouts or the fearmongers who dream of martial law. To them, this health crisis is a perfect opportunity to steal even more of our constitutional freedoms and set America up for a socialist future. For example, did you know that the Department of Justice recently asked Congress for the ability to detain Americans without trial during emergencies like this? If granted, you or I could be arrested and jailed for months, even years, until the government deems the emergency is over. Others have proposed we eliminate all political borders. I guess this would somehow magically eliminate the virus. And according to a recent story in Politico, the White House Coronavirus Task Force is considering creating a national surveillance system to track Americans' health information, essentially a health care patriot act. The truth is, after so many years in Washington, I thought I was immune to being shocked by what our government does. But the actions that our elected officials, the Fed, even the medical community have taken in the past few weeks have gone beyond anything I could have imagined. Look at what happened in just 1 week. The Senate reactivated the Patriot Act, the biggest destruction of the Fourth Amendment of our nation has ever seen, all because of a virus. Congress passed a $2.2 trillion bailout package, the biggest ever in history. Of course, with $25 trillion in debt, our government doesn't have the money to actually pay for all of this. But that's not a problem for the Federal Reserve. After cutting rates to 0%, they quickly opened the doors to unlimited quantitative easing and are now printing $125 billion a day. As part of this bailout, the government is also sending checks to most Americans, no strings attached, virtually identical to the socialist universal basic income idea on which Andrew Yang based his failed presidential run. And it might not be the last time the government uses this strategy. Of course, we all realize the money will largely end up in the hands of the well-connected rather than those who most need it. See, the biggest problem with a crisis like this is that nobody stops to ask the real questions, like, how does the financial system get so bad that a virus can collapse the entire U.S. economy? Or, will one-time stimulus actually fix the economy or just make Americans even more dependent on the government? Or even, what is the dollar actually worth if we can print an unlimited number of them? But none of this matters. Everyone just wants a quick fix, an easy handout, and politicians are happy to oblige. Unfortunately, these policies and those that are sure to follow in the coming weeks and months will cause even greater damage to the Americans they are designed to help. So please, as a citizen of this country, pay attention to what your government is doing right now. The people running our country today are living in a fantasy world. And if you're not careful, you could be the one who pays the price. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the coronavirus is harmless. People will continue dying as it continues to spread. And I agree that those most vulnerable should take precautions to limit their risk of exposure. The latest numbers from Italy's National Institute of Health show that 99% of those who died from coronavirus had at least one pre-existing condition. So people like this should definitely use common sense and exercise caution. But not everyone who gets coronavirus will die. Even more surprising, not everyone even shows symptoms, as the research and anecdotal experience is now showing. Bottom line, I believe this virus has been overhyped by government officials, and the results, which we'll only begun to see, will be to spend more money than they ever have before and wipe out even more of our freedom. It will take time and happen slowly, but it's all part of their plan to make Americans totally dependent on the government. But this is an attack on our civil liberties. You see, the reality is these emergencies, measures that get passed, never actually go away. Their long-term financial consequences continue to grow, and if you're not prepared, what's happening today will create a nightmare for baby boomers and others who are retired or nearing retirement. What our government is trying to do today has been tried many times before in dozens of countries. Hitler, Mao, Mussolini, Stalin, no matter who's in charge, these socialist policies always lead to disaster. If you think this sounds extreme, just look at what's already happening to our most basic constitutional rights. According to the Wall Street Journal, data mining firm Palantir, which was credited with helping to find Osama bin Laden, is working with the Centers for Disease Control to model the virus outbreak. Other companies that scrape public social media data have contracts in place with the agency and the National Institute of Health, documents show. So much for the Fourth Amendment. I guess it doesn't apply when you have Facebook on your phone. And guess what? If they could locate bin Laden in a remote compound in Pakistan, you and I don't stand a chance. Then there's all the shutdowns, curfews, and the quarantine orders that have swept the nation in clear violation of our Fifth Amendment rights. In many states, it is now illegal to publicly worship in a church. a blatant disregard for the First Amendment and many state constitutions as well. I've never seen anything like it in all my years in government. For years, I opposed these policies in Washington. I never voted for more debt. I tried to audit and even put an end to the Federal Reserve. I swore to uphold the Constitution, an oath I took seriously. But what the folks in Washington are doing today puts us on a course for another financial crisis, even worse than the huge stock market drop we've seen in recent weeks or the crisis of 2008. And it will ultimately result in the most dramatic presidential election of our generation. You can ignore that ugly fact, or you can take the necessary steps to protect yourself. The choice is yours, but you've got to take action personally. Get the facts for yourself. Learn the steps necessary. Protect yourself and your family from what's coming next. And that's why I put together this short message for you today. It's something you and your family can do in your own home, even if you're on government-mandated lockdown. Right now, hardly anyone in Washington is talking about this situation, honestly, with the American public. Most Americans still have absolutely no clue what's actually going on, but I'm hoping to change that today. I spent 22 years in Congress. I served on the House Banking Committee and the Committee on Foreign Affairs. I sponsored well over 600 legislative bills. I've met with every president of the last 40 years and every Fed chairman. I've spent many hours in top-secret, closed-door meetings in Washington. And today, I'm going to show you what's really happening in our country. I'm also going to recommend a great way for you to protect yourself and your family. Most people I've heard from in recent weeks correctly sense that there's something big happening in our country right now. A huge shift is taking place, but they don't know how to make sense of it. And it's ultimately because with crises after crises, 9/11, the 2008 financial crisis, to the coronavirus panic of today, our government has embarked on an out-of-control experiment, printing absurd amounts of money to bail out whoever needs it. Borrowing so much money, our country can never, ever hope to legitimately pay it back to our creditors. Of course, this was going on long before the coronavirus ever appeared. Even before the panic started, 74% of Americans were living paycheck to paycheck. And even though you might assume that refers to low-wage earners, 1 out of 4 families making $150,000 or more a year were in the same boat. Given this, it's no surprise that almost a third of American adults had no emergency savings, or that 70% of Americans have cried about money. It's also explained why household debt recently crossed the $14 trillion mark, the highest ever on a record. And why at the bottom end, roughly 40 million Americans are on food stamps. Nearly 1/6 of all children living in homes that rely on them. The latest numbers from the Congressional Budget Office show that more than half of all citizens now receive more money from government handouts than they pay in federal taxes. Perhaps this explains why membership in the Democratic Socialists of America jumped nearly 500% in the past 2 years. And why 43% of Americans now say socialism would be good for the country. But today's panic will have even more disastrous effects. Most folks don't realize that the real yield on savings right now is negative. We've already seen the stock market collapse, erasing all the gains that have accrued since President Trump took office. Goldman Sachs predicts the economic impact will cause GDP to drop 2.5 times as much as any other decline in history. Unemployment numbers are now beginning to skyrocket. Right out of the gate, unemployment filings were 20 times higher than normal in states like Michigan, and 40 times higher than normal in Louisiana. And these are likely to get much worse. 49% of companies are considering layoffs, and the Fed now estimates unemployment could eventually reach as high as 32%. With workers out of a paycheck, they will be forced to spend money they don't have just to get by. What happens then? The poorest 50% of the country already has a negative net worth. One former Trump advisor is warning that this could spark the next Great Depression. But I think the results could be even worse. Because I think the panic we're seeing, along with the economic turmoil that's growing, creates an ideal scenario for a socialist to eventually win the White House. See, when the rich, a very small percentage of the population, get in trouble with debt, it's an economic problem. But when the poor and the middle class, a huge percentage of the population, get in trouble with debt, it's a political problem. This is what the 2020 election and every election for the foreseeable future will be all about. Because unless something changes, the youngest generation is in serious trouble. You see, according to the Wall Street Journal, millennials are in worse financial shape than every generation that came before them. And I believe they will look to the government to fill this gap this fall. For one, these young Americans owe the bulk of the $1.6 trillion of student loan debt outstanding. And because wages have stagnated, they're making about 20% less than we were paid for the same work at the same age. Of course, the cost of living has soared. Today, the average young American spends half his paycheck or more on rent. Health insurance premiums have more than doubled since Obamacare. And even though 50% of millennials work 2 jobs, most are really only getting by with debt. Get this, the average millennial now owes more than $60,000. They're drowning with no escape in sight. A $1,200 check isn't going to make a bit of difference. It used to be the case that hardworking Americans could find a job, buy a home, and save for retirement. That's the promise millennials were given. It's why they went to college and took out huge loans. But that's not the case anymore. It's impossible for them to break into the middle class. For millennials, the American dream is dead.
Yep.
And these are the lucky ones. From 1979 to 2014, the poverty rate among young Americans without a college degree has more than tripled. And again, there's no escape. The future is bleak, especially when as many as 49% of companies will have layoffs this year. The only hope for this new generation is a socialist politician who will free them from their financial nightmare, which is why millennials will be the target of the most political campaigns in history. And they are going to eat it up. Don't forget that at one point, socialist Bernie Sanders had as much as 84% of the millennial vote. Pew Research calls it the most left-leaning generation in U.S. history. And now, for the first time ever, there will be more of these young voters than older voters deciding a presidential election, putting an end to 4 decades of boomer control of the polls. What do these young voters want? Well, consider how this liberal generation spent their formative years, active in all of the major recent protests: Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Dreamers, #MeToo, and March for Our Lives. Now these angry, debt-ridden young voters will decide who the next U.S. presidents will be. Even scarier, according to them, this economy they've inherited is our fault. So please, pay close attention to what I'm telling you. You've got to take action personally, and you have to do it now. Today, well, the methods of saving yourself are still cheap, easy,